It's I can get my screen to work. It's the last session in a series of 7, which is taking place to raise awareness on our discussion document consultation on energy efficiency requirements in related areas of the building regulations. We are recording this session, and we'll try and see about getting a recording up on the website afterwards. There's questions box there, so if you want to use the Q&A function, if you have any questions to submit, we'll try and take any questions at the end of the end, have a little bit of discussion if possible, if we've got time. Our discussion document on our consultation is quite specific to building regulations, so it really is aimed at people with a little bit of familiarity on the current building regulations regime and how that all operates. The consultation runs from the 26th of July until the 15th of November, so there should be a few weeks after this session to be able to make returns and get your comments in. The documents are all at the department's website there. We'd really encourage responses via Citizen Space, if possible, on the links that are there. That really helps the department assemble things. There are a lot of questions, and some of them are very specific and some are much more open-ended in general. But they come in various sections that are in the structure of the document. And if you have any queries or if you have anything you want to discuss prior to making your submission of that, then by all means use our web address there, get in touch, and we'll see what we can do to try and help. In broad terms then, we're reminding everyone about a kind of phase sort of broad programme that was discussed and released in the energy strategy. We're now in phase 2, which is our discussion document and pre-consultation on next steps, having implemented an interim uplift last June. So around June 22. So the previous sessions 2 to 6, have largely focused on quite specific proposals that are in relation to the phase 3 uplift. That would be our next uplift, and they look at various things. They look at the energy efficiency, the ventilation, overheating, and potential requirements for electric vehicle charging infrastructure. And they're all quite relatively specific. There's some options and various things in there, but they're quite specific to what would be done next. This session is really looking at subsequent phases, giving some of the wider background that's happening in other areas, the kind of issues and concurrent kind of themes in the methodologies and things that are used for energy assessments and that are kind of informing our thinking on in a slightly longer term, other than these immediate phase 3 steps. Although that said, there is some interaction with the phase 3 because it depends what you do in phase 3 as to how that all kind of works together. So, as I've said, the issues and the developments in other regions likely to influence these subsequent phases, and we're also looking at concurrent issues. And the kind of concurrent issues are really things that tend to cut across phases. So they're almost issues, some of them are almost issues of principle. And within that, we've discussions on the national methodology calculation and how that calculation works and what its assumptions are. We've also raising the prospect or asking about embodied carbon assessment and whole life assessments and how that might start to come into the picture more. We do have a question on an area on housing size, which is quite specific in particular to Northern Ireland. And we also have general open-ended questions seeking for kind of evidence or thoughts on measures that might be employed to help make improvements on the difference between the design versus the as-built performance gaps that tend to emerge or that have been highlighted in the past. But these issues are quite complicated and, as I say, quite cross-cutting and go across different administrations and all sorts of different things. So we don't see them as being particularly able to be changed in time for phase 3, because phase 3 and the uplift needs to progress. But we do think that it was worth outlining them for this broader perspective. So that's what we're saying again now, I suppose, in this slide, that the last measures introduced in England were intended to go as far as possible whilst acknowledging that the transition to low carbon heat requires market technologies such as heat pumps and the skills associated with that to be significantly developed. So these are informing proposals. England's last uplift are performing proposals for our phase 3 and that's what the bulk of the discussion in these sessions has been about up to date. But there is a strong indication in some of the early tentative moves towards future building standards or future direction of travel that's been outlined, by England. And the expectation really for phase 4 is that we would have buildings with a very highly insulated building fabric that would use low carbon heating and would be basically viewed as being net zero ready. And I think what's meant by that is that they would be able to operate with zero emissions eventually when the electricity supply is fully decarbonised. So they may not on day one be net zero, but in terms of operational performance, but as that electricity supply, if they were on electrical heating or if they were on district heating, and as that district heating decarbonised, then you would find that by 2050 or by earlier, hopefully, they'd be on a net zero level of performance. So that broad expectation is really the sort of central to the phase 4 uplift considerations. So in terms of timescale, we're waiting for DLUHC's Future Homes and Future Buildings consultation that's expected soon. But we're also very cautious because quite often consultations come through and proposals come through that are significantly changed before they're actually implemented in England. And so we really need that implementation in place for us to be very clear on where they're at so that we can then take our developments from that. And we don't want to delay in getting on with doing something meaningful in the interim. So the department's phase 3 work is intended to ensure that improvements here are progressed as far as possible in that interim. So phase 4 measures will then adopt or learn from England's Future Homes or Future Buildings measures. And that would mean that phase 4 would be likely to occur in 26 or 27. And some details and hints or some details around that on where that might be or what that Future Homes consultation might look like. When we talked about having high insulation values or good insulation values, they've outlined typical U values there of 0.15 for walls, 0.11 for roofs and floors, and 0.8 for windows. There's a fairly strong suggestion that air tightness might be 3 cubic meters per hour per square meter at 50 pascals, but it could be less. They've intimated that low carbon heating would be an expectation, but other services packages and that surround that, or various flexibilities that might apply to different building types would all need to be kind of considered to see whether all of this is appropriate or viable in those kind of circumstances. So that's the kind of overarching though kind of position that we kind of have, or that we can see going forward. Similarly, alongside that, there will be consultations on SAP and SBEM. They're the domestic and the non-domestic national calculation methodologies, and we'd anticipate that those consultations would occur alongside or as part of the Future Homes and Future Buildings developments. And we have to say to people, we really encourage local responses to that because we're so reliant on then adopting the UK's methodologies and things that flow from that. But at the same time, and that's what's in our kind of section 6A here, we're keen because we will have discussions with the UK government and things at various stages, or we're trying to come to terms with it all. It's really helpful if there are any local issues, or if there are any particular concerns, or if any feedback comes through here. If we can gather that together, we can maybe have a particular influence on how that rolls out in England. So the different fuel mix here, the different context here might be important in trying to inform how that goes. And it was just to signal to you that there is a review of SBEM. We are aware of that. I think it's principally dealing with industry stakeholder engagement, but they're looking at reform of some of the activity classes and characteristics that apply to non-domestic buildings. And they're looking to kind of update that from evidence and that they would have from those various building types and those building classes to get a more accurate kind of benchmarking about what level of improvement then might be possible. Clearly, improvements in some building types like hotels might be of a different order to the scale of improvement that might be viable in a largely unheated warehouse, for example. You know, they have different profiles, different characteristics, and there's a lot to be explored in all of that. And that's why I suppose we're so reliant on the UK drive and the UK push. So if there's anything on that, we would encourage you to try and contribute in those consultations that come up. Similarly, we'd expect that there'll be, in the future homes and future buildings work, there'll be work on validation of as-built performance and how that might be improved or how that might be seen. So again, we really do follow or we really do learn from or build upon some of the lessons in that are involved there. So whilst we are gathering evidence here, and we'll try and use that and communicate that a bit, that shouldn't rule out. In fact, we would really advocate for direct input for you to consult whenever these consultations and things come through from the UK government. So if that was future homes and future buildings and what's happening there, that's the building regulations proposals for England. Another kind of strand to this is developments in boiler policy. We've outlined something on that. So obviously the CCC advice reports, this is the one we've quoted as for Northern Ireland, but I think there are similar kind of approaches or lines being advocated for other parts of the UK. But they're obviously pushing for a position where all new heating appliance installations should be zero carbon, and with an earlier application to homes that are off the gas grid. And obviously, this has implications for supporting infrastructure, you know, and the electricity network. So our colleagues in DFE are mindful, and of course, it also leads to challenges. There are also obvious challenges in installing low carbon heating systems in existing buildings, in that they tend to work best with low temperature heating, and alongside, you know, fabric and efficiency improvements. Kind of needs that whole integrated package to work best. So we're mindful that other regions have similar kind of mandates or directions, but there's no clear provision yet as to how getting to a point on this particular issue, boilers, particularly replacements in existing buildings and dwellings, on how this is actually going to kind of be achieved. But there is one important consultation that went out, and that was from DESNZ, and that was on the requirements for any boilers sold on the GB market, with the suggestion that from 2028 they should be super efficient. In other words, really, that you wouldn't be able to have fully fossil fuel reliant. You would need to have a greater than 100% efficiency, and the way that would be achieved, I suppose, is with a hybrid system with a heat pump. And or that they could be hydrogen ready. So we see that as quite a significant thing, because it would change the standard of boilers that get sold. So admittedly, the timescale on it is a little way behind future homes and future buildings, which but it is looking at retrofit boiler replacements, and it's unclear if it would be implemented via building regulations, which would set the standard for replacement boilers when they're being installed, or whether it would be done via a product standard. And if it were a product standard, that would mean you wouldn't really be a building regulations matter. It's just the only boilers that could be sold would be off this kind of level of provision. So that's there. There might also, we don't know, there could be something in future homes and future buildings on this area. We wait and see, but we'd need to wait and see. But we think that the principal focus on future homes and future buildings will be on the new build standards. Any proposals to require hydrogen ready or hybrid heat pump boilers in GB could be subject to the Northern Ireland Protocol. So there's an issue there potentially, if we were changing product standards, and whether GB product standards would apply here, or whether EU product standards would apply here, which would be more kind of eco-design perhaps. So that's all quite a complicated area, and with EU notification procedures to prevent barriers to trade and things like that, it all becomes quite a sort of interesting or fraught position for us to have to consider, especially as we are only really a building regulations unit. So the wider position on that's a developing picture. We're also mindful then, if we move away from England and take a slightly wider approach, there's some really significant developments in Scotland that we think we've drawn people's attention to in the document. There are two significant measures. One is effectively a ban on direct emissions heating, or a requirement for zero direct emissions heating in Scotland, and the other one is a commitment to try and develop new standards such that Scottish building regulations would require a passive house equivalence standard. So if we look at the ban on direct emissions heating, which is due to apply in Scotland from 2024, April 2024, I believe, it's preventing basically any combustion appliance for boiler or hot water heating in new dwellings or new buildings. And that I think would also include what they call conversions or material changes of use to create a new dwelling or a new building, subject to a building warrant application from April 2024. So, I mean, there's a definition there for direct emissions heating, but it basically means no tailpipe emissions there in your building. And as such, we think that means you'll be effectively restricted to electric heating or district heating, with electric heat pumps likely to be dominant given the extent of district heating currently in operation. So it'd be quite hard to meet the Scottish standard with direct electric heating because of the primary energy, because of the delivered energy target that would emerge. So it's worth saying that this is a kind of slightly separate measure to the way uplifts in Scotland and in other UK regions have typically been delivered, in that it is rather than kind of a refresh of the notional dwelling that you have to compare yourself to, or a kind of overarching kind of review maybe in detail across the part. It's a very specific kind of requirement, just saying these kinds of heating is just not acceptable or not permissible. It doesn't really change the emissions performance requirement that's there, or the delivered energy performance requirement that Scotland has. So it doesn't change the assessment procedure as such. It simply says that this form of heating is no longer an acceptable route to compliance. And it is a regulatory change. So that's kind of how it has worked. It's worth really noticing a couple of quite significant things. One is that biofuels, we think, are included in this ban because they have direct emissions there in the dwelling. And we also think that even hybrid boiler heat pump solutions in new builds would seem to be subject to the ban because, again, they would have some direct emissions. So the measure is supported by the pre-planned adoption of direct emissions metric. They've always had that into building regulations assessments, and the requirement to outline a plan for conversion to a non-direct emissions heat source if the direct emissions heating is installed in new builds prior to April 2024 threshold. So some of their earlier uplifts have been signalling this to some degree, that you had to plan for how, or provide with your building regulations application a plan for how you were going to change to a zero direct emissions heating system in the future. If you were using a gas boiler or an oil boiler or a hybrid or a biomass or whatever, you had to show how you were going to move away from that in the future as part of your application. I don't know that there were many tests around that, but you still had to provide that assessment. The second significant measure coming through in Scotland, which has, worth pointing out, has a Green Minister working on this, is they've committed to develop 2024-25 proposals with a view to implementing new build standards equivalent to passive house standards. So they're looking for a Scottish passive house equivalent. And we've been kind of hoping to monitor this or see how this reviews or comes to be. But there's, again, quite a lot of issues that we see with that. So I mean, it's worth noting, of course, that full Passive House certification expects the use of approved designers, products, software, and installers that have all been approved with a private sector body. So there's an issue there to ensure the performance and build quality. It's worth noting that our building regs don't give us absolute powers on that. We can suggest it strongly in guidance, but we can't limit work to being done by just one profession or one group. We can't do that absolutely. It's also anticipated, it's anticipated because of that and various things that they're looking for Scottish equivalent performance rather than an actual requiring Passive House standards. So that's noted. But the reforms will look at both the performance metrics and the verification measures. So this is kind of happening concurrently whilst England does its thing with future homes and future buildings. This Scottish activity is kind of happening. So it's quite a potentially quite a different way of approach. And one of the big things we have with the Passive House scenario, and it comes with a range of scenarios, but it's a move to absolute technical criteria rather than by comparison to a notional dwelling or a notional building. So in Passive House's case, you've got some of the statistics there about air tightness being less than 0.6 air changes per hour, and a slightly different metric to the cubic meters per hour per square meter that applies in building regulations assessments to date. You've got space heating requirements and peak demand or peak demand alternative requirement that can be met. But the point is that wherever your house is, whatever its location, be it in the north where it's cold or in the south where it may be not so cold, where if it's on a high altitude and exposed, that will determine the level of insulation that's needed to meet that, to attain the Passive House standard. So colder locations might typically take more insulation than a warmer location, whereas under the notional dwelling standard, if you follow a set recipe, that there's a kind of degree of standardization whereby the developer can repeat that outcome wherever it is around the country that they're building. So that's really quite significant, we think. Verification, commissioning and on-site testing are also strongly enforced under the Passive House Institute certified assessments. So there's extra layers of accreditation of the people doing the work, and that really helps reduce the performance gap. And there are extra tests and things that all would need to be there. And software is seen to be quite significant as well. The use of Passive House planning package, that would be a really significant thing if that were to be used instead of SAP or trying to retrain everyone in that direction. So we're really monitoring the developments there, and we'll see what happens. But we are trying to be involved, or at least observe, and to see how the discussions on that resolve with Scotland. There are both of these scenarios, of course, tend to push significantly further towards the electrification of heat. And so you would need to take into account the deliverability from a skills and overall kind of way, but also on the grid impacts and things that happen in relation to the grid. So our electricity grid in its state is clearly kind of impacted quite dramatically by quite a lot of that, if that were all to happen all at once. And we'll also be passing on that this is happening through to our colleagues who are working on grid policy and grid areas, and to the utility regulator here, because we know that system is under and grid reinforcement charging system is all being kind of considered by our colleagues in other departments. So the outcomes of all of that interact with this. We've said before, building regs can't completely restrict work to licensed or accredited designers, installers or testers in the way that the Passive House system promotes. So that's not always possible, although we can strongly hint at it with guidance, but there should always be an alternative way to compliance. Again, we're monitoring the outcome. the complete ban and a 100% equivalence to Passive House. You know, if you were to absolutely do every single 100% thing that was in Passive House, which I think some of the advocates for it would say is necessary because it's a complete package. But if you're to do all of that, it would seem really quite a demanding level of change. But you know, we're keeping an eye on it, and we'll see what we can do, and if it goes well, that's certainly something that will be informative to the phase 4 proposals for 26 and 27. Another aspect or another major review that's undergoing is kind of a more pan-European, pan-EU development, and that's a recast of the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive, which has some very significant potential uplifts. Now, obviously, we've left the EU, so there's no absolute requirement to implement any of the things that are in it. However, and we don't think that it's embedded as a Northern Ireland Protocol issue. It's not about products or standards that are passing across the border, but obviously it will inform developments in the Republic of Ireland, and you know, working with there, and obviously it sets a kind of tone or a level of expectation across administrations, which is, you know, bears consideration. So the aspects of this which might be applied through the building regulations, I think it's important to outline not everything in the EPBD is a building regulations matter at all. But aspects of it that would have applied in the building regulations include a new zero emissions building standard, which would be applied to new buildings, public authority new buildings from 26 and all new buildings from 2028. We've different figures in brackets there because at the minute the discussions on this are still to be finalised, but it is going, some of the dates are related to the Parliament, which would have been more progressive than the dates proposed by the Commission. So we wait and see how that all emerges. They were also looking at limit values for whole life global warming potential. So that requires assessment of embodied carbon, which we'll come on to, so that would be a really significant thing, and that would start to apply from 2030. They're also looking at a ban on the use of heating systems using exclusively fossil fuels in new builds and in deep or major renovations. So that would kind of align with, I suppose, something. In fact, it goes a bit beyond, or Scotland's measures go a bit beyond this, but it would seem to be in a similar kind of vein on the direct emissions heating ban. So that's worth noting that would come in as soon as the directive were to be applied or implemented. There's also some interesting queries which are kind of harder to assess, how you would enforce things like requiring new buildings to be designed to optimize their solar energy generation potential, enabling subsequent installation of solar technologies with deployment of that solar generation, you know, within 2 years of the directive coming into force. So how one demonstrates you've optimized it, whether that's a planning issue or a building regulations issue, you know, a lot of that's quite an interesting challenge. And then there are also a plethora of indoor environmental air quality and various measures to be taken in new buildings and buildings which have undergone a major renovation. And so they're looking at, you know, carbon dioxide assessment and potential monitoring, the development, the temperature and thermal comfort assessments, relative humidity. It's an interesting one that has to be sort of within a certain remits. So various, you know, and acoustic indoor comfort, such as control of reverberation, tone, background noise level, and speech intelligibility. I mean, these are quite demanding and multiple performance requirements that would all have to be kind of brought into play and add to the regulatory provisions. It includes continuous energy monitoring in certain buildings, and it also has measures for the increased level of provision. So there was a session last week on EV charge point infrastructure, and it looks like the EPBD is already moving on from that to require higher levels of provision and to include charging for e-bikes and similar, and taking efficiency of the load management and the grid into consideration with pre-cabling. So quite a lot of extra things in there, and one of the significant ones being that any charge points would need to be able to support bi-directional charging so they'd be able to export from your car to the building as well as charge your car from the building. So that balancing and smartness all starting to come into play there. There are a number of measures that go beyond the scope of building regulations with a focus on requiring or the promotion of retrofit. And they include new energy performance requirements, looking at EPC bands of performance, and for existing non-residential, and then applying that to existing residential buildings by 2030, 2033. So that's an interesting challenge. It's worth just noting there that the EPC banding probably wouldn't be in line with the cost banding that's used, for example, in domestic EPCs here, which is a cost metric. I think most of the EU regions have a primary energy banding metric. Certainly the Republic of Ireland does. So how you band and all of that is also another whole issue that's in the directive and in the directive. They also include numerous detailed requirements around national renovation plans. So there's all sorts of things about having to produce national renovation plans, how EPC data is used and controlled. There's interesting provisions for cycling. So they're looking for cycle storage and things like that. And, I mean, one could put that in building regs possibly, but it might equally be a planning requirement. Certainly the provision and the extent of car parking is normally a planning requirement here. The extent of cycle provision is also the case, but they're looking for that, they're applying new limits to that and applying requirements for things like, consideration of outsized and unusual bicycles and things that might be needed for people with special needs and stuff like that. They've got a requirement to end the grants for fossil fuel boilers, requirements for one-stop shop provisions, all sorts of other things. And we've included or tried to list that out in a kind of table in Annex C to our document, which I have a little section of here. It goes on and on. There's quite a lot of it. But basically, elements in blue we've suggested might have been for building regulations had we been subject to this directive, and items in green might have been for other measures. So principally, most likely, or many of them perhaps under the energy performance of building certificates and inspections regulations, or under some kind of provision similar to that, or led by another department altogether. So that's it's the blue ones there that would have been may have been most applicable to building regulations. That's not to say that there couldn't be some degree of interchange around that. It would have needed to have been discussed interdepartmentally. So where does that leave us with our proposals for phase 4? Well, I think to summarise, I suppose, we expect to maintain a watching brief on all of these developments, on all these things that are going on as best we can to help inform phase 4 and beyond. We still would suggest the proposals are likely to be significantly influenced by developments in Future Homes and Future Buildings programme in the first instance. But we await the consultation on that, and we'll see how that goes. In any case, and this is kind of general, and this is possibly the benefit in pushing this message out to industry, it's really likely that very high fabric performance and low carbon heating, such as heat pumps or heat networks, would be the standard expectation for new builds here by no later than 26, 27. That's the direction of travel if you're building new buildings here, and I think we can be fairly clear that that's the mark or the way we're planning to go. Aspects of much of this may be included, or some of this might be included earlier. We do have an option for phase 3 to go with a heat pump led notional dwelling, and that might bring some of these kind of thinking and some of those aspects forward a bit if it were to be adopted, but it's a very challenging prospect to try and implement that. So if we look at that, I think it's worth just taking 2 minutes to kind of compare Scotland's zero direct emissions heating approach versus a heat pump notional building. It's kind of effectively kind of two ways where you're trying to maybe deliver something broadly in the same kind of overall direction of travel, in that you're trying to really push toward low carbon heating. So our option 2 in section 3A in our proposals for phase 3 does offer us kind of it offers two approaches. One is to follow England with a gas boiler and photovoltaic led notional dwelling. The other one would have been a heat pump led notional dwelling. Effectively, option 2 would rule out conventional combustion appliances in dwellings, but it could permit hybrids. And I think that's a really significant aspect that is effectively, we think, ruled out by the Scottish proposals, if we've interpreted it correctly. We think that their ability to cope with peaks and troughs by switching to a backup boiler effectively, or to some other mechanism, or to work in some other way, is probably going to prove quite important to the grid, particularly as the grid gets reinforced and makes this transition. And whilst these technologies are nascent at the minute, it's something it would seem unwise to rule out. Again, particularly in light of the DESNZ's consultation on boiler standards, which was suggesting a requirement to push up towards hybrid systems. So we think that that's we accept that requires good controls, and we know that there's further policy development on that would all be risky, but we think that going with this heat pump led approach as opposed to a zero direct emissions heat requirement or a straightforward ban might be more appropriate, or might be slightly more viable. So that's our current position. But we are open to receiving evidence on that, and we would point out that a direct emissions heating ban, no matter which option is done, for the next phase, for phase 3, if a minister were to be in place, or if there were to be a clear direction that we were able to take forward, saying that we just want to apply the same direct emissions heating ban that has happened in Scotland, that could be done almost as a separate measure, or a sort of mini uplift almost, although it would be quite a significant one, but it could be carried out in a different way to do the kind of more fulsome phased reviews that we've got planned. So I think you can keep that in a keep that as something that can be drawn down upon, or could be used should it be a direction that needed to be applied. Again, we'd want to see how successful or whether it works in that in Scotland, of course. Similarly, I mean, we don't know what the position will be with hybrids and how they're planning to be treated under future homes and future buildings. So again, a lot hanging on what comes through in this consultation from England, where we're not aware of the details of that yet. So we're keen to try and find out more on that and how that goes and where that leaves us. Similarly, when we look at Passive House, again, and the proposals there in Scotland, we'll follow how that works in Passive House. We go on and we discuss a bit later here some of the absolute metric principles and how that works. So there are clearly advantages in having absolute metrics. It means that every house you're getting a same kind of regular outcome. It's not inadvertently badly affected by its location or altitude, or because it's in it's got a different set of conditions. Means that everyone's kind of treated equally in terms of their bills and running costs, but they're not treated equally in terms of their capex, the capital expenditure to get it done. So there are pros and there are cons. There are reasons why a notional dwelling specification was proposed and developed years ago, why we compare to that. And those reasons are still exist. So they give by having a notional dwelling specification, you can set up a system and that it will always guarantee compliance. So if you move away from that, you've got less standardization, and that's likely to slow your delivery, because every single home and every single location needs reconsidered and adjusted, or may need reconsidered and adjusted, unless you're significantly passing the targets in your first instance. We think there are quality assurance aspects on the build, so the whole Passive House system requires on everything all working, and that means there's lots of kind of societal and skills improvements in that are needed to ensure you get that whole piece working together. There are planning and rural impacts. So detached dwellings obviously will have a harder time under an absolute metric approach. They're already more expensive to build because they have more surface area to floor space value considerations there, but so they're more costly. But the poorer form factors would require even more insulation and better to get that better performance that they would then have. Again, we come back to skills and commissioning capacity and the reliability. And there are also potentially some behavioural risks. So if mechanical ventilation and heat recovery filter replacements needed every 6 months to a year, can we guarantee that that will happen? What are the consequences if it doesn't? There are acknowledging, whilst at the same time acknowledging there are risks in some of the natural ventilation solutions and things perhaps not being employed in existing dwellings. So it's an overall picture. We need to be balanced about it, but it would be quite significant reform to take all of those issues on and get there with that. And the other kind of aspect is that all of that overall would seem likely, but perhaps not entirely the case, likely to present a more challenging picture and range of issues to overcome. And that the sort of more straightforward proposal is usually to quickly follow and implement and replicate the measures when they've been implemented in England. That has been kind of the tradition to date. Now, whether that's sufficient or whether that's still the case, because we don't quite know where England are going to land at and what's going to be included in their proposals. We have to wait and see, but certainly that provides, that's often the most straightforward route. Again, as with phase 3, anything that gets done in phase 4 has this wider cross-departmental interconnection with a world of lots of other issues that we're all reliant on. And to the extent where I've had to actually, there's the one slide where I've had to change the size of the font to be smaller so that they all fit on the slide. But the list is there. It's the same as phase 3. We're affected by grid. We're affected by skills. We're affected by what happens in terms of smart systems and smart meter rollout and flexibility and management of peak loads, and whether our grid can cope in the same way that the GB grid or the grid in other regions might. You're looking at implications on EPC fitness and how that might resolve, and how you would migrate from one system for EPCs now if you had if you moved to absolute metrics rather than using UK averages and things, how that would interact. It's a really complicated picture how that all works together, and it will be mutually supportive or mutual. There will be mutual interrelated issues to be resolved or reconsidered in the midst of all of that. So the list is there. So at the end of phase 4, the end of section 5, we have a number of questions that basically go through what I've been discussing, asking for your input on that, asking whether you think it would be best to align with future homes and future buildings more straightforwardly and quickly, and not spend too much time possibly being distracted by all these other sort of tantalizing options or things that are being developed in other areas, because it could just lead to delay and might not actually get us anywhere. Would you support a ban on direct emissions heat generators? Is that something that you think is sort of a viable or a better route to kind of look at? Do you support alignments or efforts to align the targets and things toward passive house where possible, if that's how that goes, or have you any experience on that? And bear in mind how that would be enforced and delivered. It's a different thing doing it as a voluntary thing as opposed to how it all actually gets enforced, quite a different context. Do you have any advice as to how further verification measures might help ensure the standard is delivered in practice? So we're relying on things like third-party certification of mechanical ventilation systems and acoustic tests on mechanical systems, on maybe there's in situ testing can be done for heat transfer coefficient, or for hot plate testing on walls and things. So we're open to receive all that kind of evidence. And we're also wondering if there are any thing in the non-domestic sector, you know, so there are any particular issues there. The one that we're mindful of and mentioned in the discussion document is the difficulty in assessing, if you're generating electricity on a non-domestic building, the difficulty in assessing how much of that electricity will be used by that building, and how much would be exported to the grid or otherwise. The current SBEM tool, for example, even the one that England now have in place, can't yet deliver on that or give us that assessment. And that's actually quite important in the long run, because you know, having a really large array on a school or a supermarket or something that can't export, and the school, you know, particularly a school over the summer when the building's empty, all that electricity actually isn't generated, but the building regulations assessment has maybe given it the benefit as if it were generated, and discounting off the carbon value of the building. So we think that there's issues like that in the non-domestic sector, and if there's anything else that you think that we should be alert to, that's something we'll be keen to try and progress, so that we're informed or better informed when we are discussing it with colleagues in England and those working on the SBEM for the UK government. So phase 5 would be, you know, 29, 30. It's a fair distance off. It's relatively horizon scanning, I suppose, at the minute. It's quite speculative, because it really does depend on what we do for phase 3, for phase 4, and what happens in wider energy strategy developments. That will all kind of inform that. But it's worth bearing in mind that you would be working alongside the UK government expectations that, you know, replacement heat generators in existing buildings should be at least more than 100% efficient, if not, you know, low carbon entirely. Measures to address and assist with electrical storage and peak capacity limits, like I've just been discussing. More refined smart systems performance and indicators. So how will SAP and SBEM cope, you know, if you're on a particular tariff, or if you've got a particular way of, you know, if you have an EV, you might get an electric vehicle that's charging and connected to your dwelling and has bi-directional charging. How would that get assessed in SAP? And what happens if actually you have the charger and everything, but you don't have the car? How do you account for that, you know, on your outputs, and on, you know, and again, how that all integrates, not just with building regulations, but potentially with EPCs, or potentially to give you as a householder a proper idea as to how things are working. Similarly, operational performance targets and post-occupational feedback. So how that might work, and either on your own dwelling or building level, but more importantly, maybe even again in feeding back to some of the sort of factors of safety and things that maybe need to be applied to SAP assessments or EPC, or to whatever assessment tool is used. Further measures to improve assurance on construction, for example, additional testing and validation assurance of as-built performance. So we've spoken about that, but it's just a continuous process of trying to see what's the right balance and getting that right, and making sure standards are driven up. But the regulatory burden is bearable. Other related measures, such as improved embodied carbon, so body carbon and the whole life cycle performance, we kind of see that coming into play more significantly, with potential obviously for design for dismantling or other circular economy principles perhaps starting to feed and inform the developments at that stage. But that's broadly where we see it. So if we pause for breath for 1 second, those are the kind of specifics for phase 4 and phase 5. Section 6, and they were covered in section 5 of our document. Section 6 of our document is a slightly more complicated area, because it's looking at the uplifts and the various proposals and everything else, but there seem to be kind of concurrent or cross-cutting themes that in theory could equally inform some of the developments in phase 3, 4, or 5. They could apply almost at any kind of stage, or they're almost, on some occasions, they're almost matters of fundamental principle, where we need to challenge ourselves to think, are we using, if we've set this out, are we designing to the metrics, or have we got the metrics right, for example, or are these things, do these other things need to be kind of considered? And even if we are right, I think it's just important that we take a little bit of time to just review them and check and be clear about why we're doing what we're doing. And even and there are some areas where it's all to play for, or it's all to consider. And we've identified 4, but undoubtedly there are more, and there is more complexity to all of this. It could go on. So I mean, we'll take any comments back, but these were the 4 that kind of came through as the most kind of relevant or important. These are methodology issues. This whole area of whole life carbon assessment and embodied carbon. We have a section which is particular to Northern Ireland on oversized homes, and then there's the whole prospect yet again of performance validation. So section 6A, sorry, each of these sections gets covered in a different section: 6A, 6B, 6C, 6D. So section 6A looks at the NCM, and it's not really considering the targets. It's not considering the notional building or anything like that, but it's the assumptions and the methodology. What assumptions are made and how are the calculations developed? And that's really what we're trying to get at, real foundational sort of stuff in a way. Now, in general, the department's strong preference and the way we've had to do things is to influence the UK's NCM programme to ensure our local position is properly considered within its overall remit, rather than introducing a Northern Ireland independent methodology. With, there'll always be 1 or 2 maybe minor peculiarities that have to be considered for here. That's fine. But to try and set up a wholly new or independent Northern Ireland way of doing business, I think is viewed really as being disproportionate. So, but with that in mind, we can see kind of the plates, the tectonics on this maybe being questioned again or being reviewed. So we'll see again what comes through in England's Future Homes and Future Buildings and in EPC fitness reform. But these issues are kind of coming. And one of the really significant ones is kind of the difference between a notional dwelling and notional average and UK averages, and using them versus the particular standards or particular location in the particular situation for your particular building. So that comes in a range of ways. So the three big ones there that we've given as an example are, the form of the building. If you're comparing to a notional building in at the NCM, then you're not really penalised for your form, although you are, because it's going to be more expensive to build, but that's something you're accepting. But if you had a form fact, if you have an absolute metric, a performance of 15 kilowatt hours per square meter per year, then for space heating demand, for example, then your form factor and your location will obviously have an impact on that, depending on the weather file and the weather at that location, and depending on the shape. If you have a long thin building, obviously you're losing more heat, so you have to do even more insulation than had you a compact form. The other one is then UK average conditions versus local conditions. So in many of the assessments were based on a UK average location in the East Pennines. There's not a huge difference, we don't think, between the UK average condition and our Northern Ireland weather file, but it's worth bearing in mind. And then the other one is kind of current conditions versus future conditions over the lifetime of the building. And these things, by going for UK averages, you're getting a better way of comparing things, you could argue, in some respects. So your building compared to another building compared to another building, it's assessing the building. It's not taking into account the location or the idiosyncrasies of that location that may affect that building. It's really assessing your construction quality, one could say. But it's giving a less predictable outcome, I suppose, for the actual performance at a specific location. So you get less accuracy. Pardon me. So as well as providing So it's just worth bearing in mind, I suppose, yes, as each new notional dwelling or recipe and each new edition of the NCM, each new edition of SAP and that comes forward, you get improved understanding of the building physics. It changes, so there's a list of the recent changes there. I'll not go through them all, but you know, it includes more emissions. It updates the notional dwellings and buildings for building regulations assessments. It changes maybe the way lighting has been assessed because they've improved the way that they understand the building physics around that. One big one here is that SAP has now revised to be able to assign the extent of exported versus self-consumed electricity on site for dwellings. Hasn't done it yet for non-dwellings. But those kind of changes are kind of typical of what happens with each edition of SAP. The notional dwelling, as I've said before, there compares an absolute approach versus the absolute approach. Looks at these things that we've discussed, and it has a tendency to have less accuracy. And many of these changes would be reflected, but it's important to realise many of these will be reflected in both. When we're dealing with building regulations, many of these will be reflected in both the notional building and the actual building. So if you have one set of assumptions for the notional building and it's applied to the actual building, there's relatively little impact. So if you assume a UK average location, if your notional and your actual building, there's maybe relatively little impact in trying to get building regulations compliance because you've got the same set of assumptions applying to both. Whereas if you so for many of those situations that's fine, but what it will mean is that your outcome is less accurate to what you actually get. If you go with an average location, you should have a less accurate outcome to compare the actual performance. So this is why SAP and that is reviewed, and SBEM are viewed as a compliance tool, not a design tool. And that's kind of critical or kind of important. So like here's an interesting example which has been included in Annex B, and this relates to some of our options for new dwellings and some of the modelling we did there. So in this scenario, we've got 3 different carbon factors that can be applied. One is what is applied in the new version of SAP, the carbon factor that's applied in England there. One is a Northern Ireland estimate at the bottom, which is what we think the current carbon factor for Northern Ireland actually is. And the interim one is the current DAP one used in the Republic of Ireland, which is taking a longer term, a 10-year forward looking, I think it is, projection of what the carbon emissions from electricity will be. And when we model our various buildings, we've 2 notional dwellings here. One's a gas boiler with photovoltaics and one with an air source heat pump. Well, under the SAP assumptions, you see that the air source heat pump has regulated emissions of 388 kilograms, whereas the gas boiler with photovoltaic emissions has over a ton of emissions. Both of them, incidentally, quite significantly improved from the current position. But so there's significant improvements in both, but there's really significant improvement with the heat pump. However, if you apply the local carbon estimates to that, you get a kind of reversal of that position because you're getting significantly more value for the electricity that has been generated by the photovoltaics. It's offsetting 340 kilograms for each kilowatt hour of electricity that's generated, or 340 grams, sorry, for each kilowatt hour of electricity that's generated by the photovoltaics, whereas the heat pump is consuming 340 grams of carbon for each kilowatt hour of electricity that it generates. So if you were to base it entirely on today's scenario, you would end up with actually almost worse emissions because you've no photovoltaics on this building, but lots of photovoltaics on this building, and because you're electrically heating this building. But that's not likely to be the long-term position. And the important thing, though, is to appreciate the degree of discrepancy between what SAP 10 would say, which is almost a reverse opposite of what the actual position would be if you were to adopt those figures, and the interim sort of position, or the in-between position, is probably, you know, not a bad line of approach. But that shows that the heat pump is kind of better, which it was likely to be in the short to medium term, but not of the same degree of significance as would be implied if you were just to use the UK average carbon factor for electricity. And I think it's worth pointing out that this kind of discrepancy isn't just necessarily Northern Ireland. There could be, I'm not 100% all over it, but there could be equal grid distribution issues within regions across the UK. So, this idea of more and more accurate local characteristics being put into the software is potentially quite influential and potentially quite important in taking forward decision making and where you're going. It's certainly important that those writing policies take account of it, even if it isn't in the assessment. But the assessment is also there to be reviewed. So listen, much of this area and much of these considerations have been gone through in quite a bit of detail. There was an Etude report commissioned by, I think it was BEIS at the time, now DESNZ, the Department for Energy Security and Net Zero. And they set out some recommendations, and we have a table of those kind of recommendations, and it does relate to kind of EPCs. But examples of them are the one I've just given there. But a list here of some of the more significant ones in terms of the national calculation methodology and how it affects building regulations include use of forward-looking cost carbon forward-looking factors, using a fixed value of numeric outcomes per square metre rather than having a notional dwelling that you're comparing to, using local weather rather than the UK average assumptions. So again, that's an example where there's maybe not a dramatic impact if applied to a notional and an actual building, but it will have an impact if you're doing something other than the notional building recipe. If you're trying to do more offsetting with more photovoltaics, you might find it easier or more difficult depending on the grid factor that applies, or depending, on the weather that applies, because you would have maybe a greater heat loss because you took the insulation that was off. It all interacts. So that's the kind of thing to bear in mind. With the local grid factors, they've got this long-term issue about whether you should be considering the small power electrical vehicle cooking loads from unregulated power. You've got the issues about how you better consider smart demand and flexibility, and then you're back to this issue about the EPBD4 and how you work with that, or whether you diverge with that, and what the pros and cons and all of that are. So listen, there are some examples sort of saying if you went with local weather but notional building, if you went with local weather and an absolute targets, it tries to outline some examples of how that rolls out in the discussion document. So our current thinking on this is that more accurate factors could promote better individual assessment accuracy. However, we're really mindful that the workload and the risk in maintaining that would challenge departmental resources. Some issues, such as forward-looking carbon intensity factors and potential smart readiness indicator measures, they're likely to need to be developed anyway as part of the whole of the UK. So, I mean, that's kind of there. But maintaining local characteristics can be a bit more difficult in Northern Ireland only basis. There's also issues in terms of things like getting software suppliers to update it to consider the small market that's in Northern Ireland. So working with software suppliers and seeing we'd be interested in their sense of this, whether they think this is a necessary or worthwhile endeavour. Or whether just following England and going with UK averages is just the straightforward way to go. We also are mindful that there might be little practical outcome of it. You might get a more accurate numeric number at the end, but it mightn't actually make a huge amount of difference to how you have practically demonstrated compliance for building regulations or not. It might be more straightforward to just go with what everyone else is doing, and then everyone has a bit more straightforward certainty, even if the number is, or if there has to be a caution applied to the final numbers that come out in terms of your thing. We're also really mindful that this impacts on EPC assessments and the EPC fitness review that the UK is currently carrying out. So as we've said here, it's nonetheless important that policymakers and people relying on EPCs and on these building regulations assessment understand that the local position isn't necessarily reflected in the assessment procedure. We'll keep a watching brief on all of this and see how the work on metrics and smart readiness indicators reforms pan through. We have a section on embodied carbon, and I'm sure that almost everyone listening is very aware that on this topic. So obviously, whilst operational carbon deals with the emissions from a building's use, embodied carbon assessment measures emissions involved in the materials production, delivery, installation, and also normally also considers what happens at the end of the building's life. So as operational emissions are being reduced by some of the things that we're doing, obviously the carbon content of all of that material and all of that extra insulation and services and everything else becomes increasingly significant. And the idea, I suppose, is that you have a whole life assessment which looks at this whole wider picture. And it's all kind of summarized by this diagram from 15978, which looks at these various product life cycles. So all of life cycle A is the kind of upfront emissions to get the building kind of built. So that's a kind of important stage. The in-use emissions would be the operational stuff. There's an end-of-life stage. Sorry, the operational emissions are in stage B, B6 and B7. And then you've also got their cycles there for maintenance, repair and replacement and all of that. And then the end-of-life stage obviously is in the demolition and disposal or recycling. So it's a huge piece of work, and there are lots of people working on it at the minute to try and consider how that might all come to be. We're sympathetic to the aspirations of all of this, of course, but agreement on the scope of the assessment and how the values are applied and all the rest is not straightforward, and the bureaucracy with it we consider is likely to be quite significant. So any practical delivery requires significant consideration and agreement, really on a pan-administration basis, is what we're saying. And it needs to include a range of areas. So it's clarity on the scope of the assessment. Do you include the landscaping works outside? How do you then set a target that addresses that? If you have one office block with landscaping work and another office block which doesn't, how do you deal with end of life assumptions? How do you set agreement on what the carbon factors for 20 years time are going to be whenever you're maintaining or replacing a boiler or a heat generator? So there's huge amounts of assumptions needed if you're to try and make an assessment on that, and agreement on standardizing of those is absolutely critical, and there are lots of people working on that. So we're mindful that is ongoing. Similarly, there could be challenges, and facing those challenges down from some sectors that might not fare well in whatever set of assumptions are assumed. And then we've got the extra challenge that even if this were agreed at GB, there could be potentially protocol concerns or issues on that you're opening barriers to trade if you've made some material or something difficult to import when previously, and a building which is routinely imported feels it's being discriminated against, or a supplier feels they're being discriminated against with an unfair assumption. Agreement on how the default values or assumptions may be reviewed over time. So as the embodied carbon lowers alongside decarbonisation of energy supplies. So in 20 years' time, you would like to think there would be less carbon in a replacement boiler than there is in a current boiler. So, but how much do you reduce that by? There are environmental product declarations. How do you accept them, and are you content that their oversight regime is really robust and really works? And again, takes into account all the things that we've talked about. There's issue about the accreditation or the authorization of the assessment tools. Does that need to be overseen? A kind of approved software methodology. So then of course there's the oversight, training, accreditation for standards for those carrying out the work. Similarly, on enforcement, how do we ensure that building control can oversee and manage the enforcement of any new requirements? It's a huge undertaking and a huge, enormous additional assessment. There's also the issue about how could you rectify a building if it had failed, if it had too much embodied carbon? I mean, and yet the worst thing to do would be to somehow demolish the building, obviously. I mean, so how do you actually rectify? So is building regulations the appropriate mechanism to try and sort of make that kind of consideration? So that and data management and oversight of that and contributing to all of that is a fairly enormous and complex area. So our conclusion or our position on that at the minute is that we expect to cooperate with other administrations on these issues rather than to develop a local or an independent approach. And I hope we can kind of see why, but that's where we're at. And we want to get on with the measures where we know we can take action on the operational end for now. But we're keen to receive feedback on this. We are suggesting if there might be an option for some kind of advisory or information note or some sort of view to encouraging, so that perhaps when people do this extra work and undertake these embodied carbon assessments for their own purposes, there's encouragement to do that or to carry that out, and possibly even to feedback to district councils and or ourselves. The upshot of that, actually, have we overshot it here? Are we requiring such low emissions that you've to, in operational phases, that you're spending more carbon on the insulation to getting the insulation installed and more carbon on the photovoltaics on the roof or whatever it is you've needed to do to meet the targets we have set, such that actually you're getting a worse outcome over the whole life? We're always open to trying to receive that kind of research and assessment. We'll see how that goes and where that's at. But yeah, we're happy enough to see if there's some kind of advisory note or wider guidance, but not a prescriptive requirement in building regulations. Just moving on, the next kind of phase of that obviously is if everything were decarbonised, then there's little point in measuring carbon. So if all of those supply chains were fully decarbonised, but clearly there's a need for a kind of more circular economy assessment in that scenario. So we're keen for any information on that, or on how establishing lifetime standards, a building's built to last 100 years as a minimum, kind of as an expectation. What does that actually look like? How do you get that embedded in general? So these are long-term kind of horizon scoping sort of consideration, but if there's anything on that that more feedback could be provided, now's the time. This is a discussion document that's looking for the long term, so this is the time to make the comment. Our next part then is a brief note on oversized new homes. So some of our information suggesting that detached homes seem to be significantly larger on average here than in the UK. We're asking, is that right? Have we got that right? Is that the right thing? Because that's what our EPC data seems to be suggesting. They seem to be significantly larger than what should be required or what's necessary. And we think that there's little there's limited benefit in improving the emissions and energy performance per square metre if at the same time we're creating buildings that are significantly larger than necessary. So we're wondering if some kind of warning note, if you're over 25% on the Housing Association Guide standards, or if there were some kind of either in the EPC or building regulations assessment, is that something that we need to be exploring, or is this just an issue for others in planning, or where should we go with this, or is this really that relevant? So we have a question on that. And then our last question, our last area, is looking at the performance gap. So that's concerns with the difference in post-occupancy performance and what people were expecting. Some of this we think is due to this misuse of SAP as a kind of design tool rather than a compliance tool, when the design tool is assumed average UK locations and English grid factors or UK average grid factors and things like that, and therefore you get different outcomes and even pricing in fuels and things as well. what we'd be interested as to local evidence is, is there a perception or is there evidence that there's somehow a worse performance gap here than perhaps in other regions? We don't have any real evidence on that. And then we're also looking for any areas where people think, improvement might be beneficial. It could be additional in situ testing, that new tests that are under development that we haven't really explored yet. More formalized sign off, or putting your name to it, that this is definitely how I built it, particularly on as built details and that. We've some proposals on that for phase 3 with photography. And on-site geolocated photography. But we're asking really, is there anything else? What's the next step in an involvement in that, and what's proportionate to getting there? Because you could find that the costs of enforcement are more than the benefits so easily. And we've raised some of those issues there. And includes things like amending the NCM again, and are there issues? Should there be a factor of safety to include thermal comfort taking where fabric efficiencies are improved, and things like that? And then feedback from the UK government's looking at SMETRs programs where they're able to intelligently use smart metering data and maybe 1 or 2 sensors in the building to confirm or to say to people, why you're running your home here on high temperature heat in bursts, and it's less efficient if you were to run it continuously at a low temperature. You would have cheaper bills and a better outcome. Is that maybe where the differences have lain in the design versus the as-built? So there's all these sort of considerations to be had, and again we ask sort of some specific and some general questions on that. So listen, I've taken a race through here. I'm sorry it has taken longer than I thought, an hour and 20 minutes there. I don't know if there are any questions have come through.